Okay, so I would like to discuss Master's discourse, both within Lacanian discourse theory and within a greater context of cultivation, both of one's well-being and perhaps spiritual practice. Why is it relevant? Well, majority of what is transmitted in the sense of teaching within spiritual arts is a form of Master's discourse in one way or another. And also major reason for the neurosis and other subjective structures, as well as presence of the unconscious, psychopathology, is Master's discourse as well. In fact, Master's discourse is what engendered psychoanalysis back in the 18th century, 19th century. Okay, let's dive into it. First of all, what engenders Master's discourse? Why does it originate? The story is as old as Freud's totem and taboo text about the primal father and the authority of the latter. So we speak about authority which is undisputed. So first, what engenders Master's discourse is authority. Authority plus power. If we look into organization of human societies back from olden days, there is always some kind of chieftain and the head of the clan or the tribe which disseminates the law. One abides by this law. So the outcomes of this are obey or punishment or expulsion from the tribe or from the group which operates under a particular law of power and authority. And that goes through centuries, you know, from chieftains of the clans to governments of the countries through the feudal kingdoms, etc. There is always some kind of figure of authority which gives that notion of this is how it is, obey or else, basically. We have the same constitution, of course, within the structure of the psyche of every human being. Freud called it Oedipus complex, whereby the father's authority or the other's authority, doesn't have to be father, not a nuclear family anymore, gives a certain law, a certain prohibition. This instantiates the unconscious because that which does not fit in the prohibition and the law gets dumped into the unconscious, gets repressed, and circulates there in the stream of discourse, which we call the discourse of the other, language of the other, as Lacan would have it. Okay, that's the major source of Master's discourse. What is the reasoning behind Master's discourse? None but power and authority, which are often paired with some kind of sexual potency, virility, or social potency and capacity to make links and alliances and create basis of support for oneself, for one's figure of authority, and perhaps supported by some kind of military situation. From then on springs something that supports the discourse of the master, and that's a variety of institutions of society which have arisen there from, you know, like legislation, various cabinets of bureaucracies, etc. But another altogether another source of Master discourse is what we call consensus notions. Consensus notions. And these belong to such fields as science, perhaps, or knowledge attained via trial and error, via some kind of experiment, by a group of people. And that group of people come to shared conclusions. For example, artifices, craftsmanships. There has been a certain practice which has, through trial and error, identified the best way to go about things, and that way has become master's discourse. This is the master discourse, no longer purely based on authority and power, although that can take place in here as well. Authority and power of skill, knowledge, etc. But already based on some kind of objective, verifiable apparatus. Cause and effect, this leads to that, this becomes generalized, we have some kind of formula. Here, we could say the directive is obey because sensible to do so. Yeah. Laws of physics, apple falls from the tree, there is law of gravity, that's the mathematical formula for it. Follow it in your calculations and your goings about, because it's sensible. Right. So these are kind of, two major sources. So you have here what? a legislative apparatus and state power governing, scientific community, medicine, what have you, industries, technologies, ways of doing things which have been proven to work. But we also have the third source of master's discourse, which is, I'll say, direct knowledge. Of truth. And this belongs to the register of religious revelation or spiritual insight into the nature of reality. One could argue that somewhat 2,500 years ago there has been this overarching uncovering of universal law, we call it Buddha Dharma, which has been attained via direct insight, enlightenment, and then thereby shared. So the directive to this kind of knowledge does not really go in terms of obey. There's no such thing. We could say it's verify by practice. Verify by practice. These things need to be verified, need to be looked into through your own effort, which is exactly what Buddha recommended, for example. He didn't advocate any belief or whatever, didn't enforce his authority, he just shared it, revealed it, expounded the practice, and it kind of struck into the heart and nature of things. There is suffering, there is impermanence, etc. There is a way of things to go about it. The way of practice leads beyond it. Okay. Now, all of this is actually problematic when it comes to human psyche. Why? Well, because human psyche takes things ready-made when it comes to master signifier and just internalizes it. And what happens with the master discourse is, okay, well, probably it would be easier to actually draw a formula of master's discourse and show how it works. Let's do it. Let's see in the exact detail how master discourse works. So we have Lacanian discourse theory and the formulas for any discourse. We have 4.5 kind in total: discourse of the master, discourse of the university, discourse of hysteric, and discourse of the analyst, and discourse of capitalism as a mutant of master discourse, which we come back to briefly today. How does discourse rotate? Well, we have an agent which addresses other. That agent is directed by a certain truth, which is repressed, hence it's under the bar. This interaction doesn't really reach its culmination, as we have this kind of cross, because the address never really reaches the other. And so we have product of this interaction. That product will also be disjunctive to the truth, because initial truth was foreclosed for the agent, the other hasn't quite received it properly due to nature of language and miscommunication. So the product does not correspond to the truth. Yet the product affects the agent, the one who sent the address, and the hidden truth, without the subject actually enunciating it, affects the other, because we can always feel what unconscious narrative is transmitted to us beyond words. So, which terms are in each of these positions in case of master discourse? Well, of course, we have S1, the master signifier. What is under the bar is the subject of the unconscious, or the barred subject. Master signifier addresses the knowledge within the other. Note, it doesn't address the other as split subject. It doesn't address the other as jouissance, as libidinal discontent, as some kind of luck, but addresses the subject as someone who is full capacity, possesses of knowledge, devoid of subjective division, and is capable of executing their own decisions flawlessly. So the product of this, of course, is so-called R, or object A, libidinal discontent, the surplus enjoyment, which engulfs the addressee and produces further phenomena of dissatisfaction. Of course, hidden address of the master who operates according to master discourse affects somebody who receives that discourse, and the product in turn affects the disseminator, the master, because they receive not what they have addressed to. They do not receive the clear, direct following back from a subject who's supposed to possess of knowledge, but they receive more confusion, discontent, and libidinal problematic. So, key problem of the master discourse, what was it? Barred S, subjective division is denied. Yeah. Subjective division is repressed. Yeah, it's down there under the bar. Division is not seen. Yeah. What is present is only this S1. S1, which is what? S1 is a thesis, dogma, authority. Remember, human psyche does not operate under the perfect knowledge. There is a degree of division, always degree of ignorance. That's why we are all here. So the thesis, dogma, and authority, teaching, method, conviction, confidence, certainty of application do not quite reach, because they have not been really tested and verified by the subject. And yet the other is treated as someone who can put this method, this dogma, this authority into practice within themselves, as if they are in perfect capacity to do so, as if they have no obstacle in doing so. So they are turned into this S2, the knowing subject, this very Aristotelian subject of unobstructed logical reason, or Descartes' subject of cogito ergo sum. It's not that. The subject is here. The subject is divided. And that is suppressed, that is divided, that is denied. So, what ends up being message of the master's discourse? Here is this thesis. There is this method. There is this teaching. Apply it to yourself, yeah, in order to attain some kind of progress or accomplishment or realization, if you talk about spiritual practice. However, the result, if one operates on the master's discourse, is this. Or objet petit a. Object small a. That Lacanian invention of surplus enjoyment, excess pressure of the drive field returns in the body, which in fact emerges via interaction of language and libido. That leftover, which language doesn't quite capture. No matter how good and profound are these master signifiers, this knowledge, this word of God, if you want it, it will not fully capture jouissance. And what will remain of it is objet A. That very specific to each human individual, every human subject, modicum of discontent, modicum of internal pressure which bubbles up, which causes symptoms and also causes desire. We call it object cause of desire. So, because again, object is produced, desire is engendered, the discourse rotates. It repeats. Once again, let's recapture. Master discourse assumes that there is certain attainment that can be gained, either skill or knowledge or following of laws or attainment of realization. It assumes that a subject, the other, is perfectly capable of doing so, that they're in full control. They just need to apply it to themselves, which produces result. The only thing to do is continuously, correctly, wholeheartedly apply this dogma, method, authority of the master. This needs to be repeated over and over in order to master something. So the discourse rotates, so the process rotates. What is problematic is that subjective division is denied, addressed to this jouissance, this surplus enjoyment, this dreadful yet pleasurable aspect of internal life, what we call the real, is denied both by the master and denied in the subject it treats. This here relation relation of the agent to the other is what we call semblance. Why is it called semblance? Well, precisely because of this. S1 to S2. One signifier to the other. The subject is what represents one signifier to another signifier. Effervescent Lacanian subject. All the operations within Master's discourse are performed on the level of this virtuality. The real is denied in the agent. Here is real, subjective division. The real is denied in the other. Here is the real of surplus enjoyment. So what remains is the interaction on the level of semblance, the symbolic, the modicum of representation. So we have what If we take the first example, the power and authority, we have more legislation. And the legal systems are perfect representative of that. We treat what has happened through the words, through the formulas, through the legal entities. There is not even a subject there, not even a real being there. There are just their semblance found in language, in legal terms. And same actually happens in religious discourses. There are certain notions assigned to subjects which they're treated with. They're supposed to perform certain actions, and then it all becomes kind of ritualized and it's not real. So material pertaining to transferential unconscious of divided subject and real unconscious of the latter, of actually specific particular traumatic jouissance, is denied. That real material is not dealt with within Master's discourse. Because these aspects are under the bar, yeah, they are sort of closed, foreclosed. What this engenders is generalized perversion. And hence the predilection of Master's discourse to mutate into capitalist discourse, which I have talked about in a different video. And again, that discourse rotates and produces more discontent and causes the subject to rotate in the system of consumption, thereby burning out. So, because all interaction is done in the semblance, the subject becomes alienated in this ever exceeding horizon of the real. Yeah? The more we treat something through terms of discourse, through symbolic notions, the greater the phenomenon of the neck of the bottle, the greater becomes the opening of that which we do not treat with language, which we cannot touch with language, which can never be touched with language, which cannot stop not being written. So it carries on. What arises from there are the false sense of certainty and conviction. When everything is captured within the network of language, seemingly everything, yeah. When the correct thesis and method and dogma are disseminated, even though they're correct, there is yet something not quite there, something off. That's the horizon of the real. So, from what I observe, a lot of contemporary scene of the, let's take spiritual scene as an example, because that's what I'm really interested in, of teachers, of certain religious figures, etc., operates on the level of this discourse, disseminating this kind of semblance, the knowledge towards their followers, their people who listen to them. Sometimes, if it's done sincerely, honestly, it produces a certain phenomena which we look into, the phenomena associated with the long-term practice of Master's discourse. And sometimes, if it's not done sincerely, it produces the market of these short-term solutions, quick fixes, which are disseminated in the form of courses, certificates, workshops, whatever, that obfuscates commitment. And thereby Master's discourse, under those circumstances, mutates to capitalist discourse. However, if it remains in this level, and that's what we're going to look at now, we're looking into the problematic of a long-term engagement with Master's discourse. So what happens during a long practice of Master's discourse? So, because discourse rotates, it circulates around the hidden truth. That's the hidden truth, subjective division, that the master is not quite master. The king is naked, so to speak, because their subjective division is denied through the very confident, very direct, very on point articulation that they disseminate. Because this truth is denied, more semblance is created, and what arises is identity of a practitioner. In someone who follows that narrative. That identity of a practitioner does not allow a specific, highly individual solution to this, to libidinal discontent within the subject, to that very traumatic core of the real. Instead, what it does, it produces more layers of semblance. More layers of semblance create further separation from the real. So we have characteristic dullness of a practitioner who follows the narrative of the master directly, without kind of questioning, without changing, just following it, implementing it, being a good student, so to speak, or a good citizen, or whatever, or good artisan. Dullness arises because the drive pressure, that's this very raw animalistic vitality present in the subject, is denied. What is denied is their not all, their division. Their lack is denied somewhat. And that's what borders on psychotic narrative, actually. But anyway, having named everything through the theory, the discipline of spiritual practice they follow, they produce more discontent because the real is not written by that. The real only increases with the application of language, of system, of method, of concept. So we have this then closed loop of functioning, which is very similar to the principle of repetition within the theory of the drive. The drive pressure repeats itself. I have a separate lecture on the drive, you can look into that. Same happens here, that the insistence of the surplus enjoyment within object A repeats. But the drive itself is never addressed. Yeah. A loop that bypasses the drive. Here's what makes me think of spiritual bypassing, that pop term that has been circulating around. The real bypassing, the only real bypassing is this. Bypassing of one's own drive through whatever, through language, through identity of a practitioner, through rituals and whatever things one does in order to touch upon this very traumatic core. So, what is the result of all this? So let's say number 4. Number 4 is the result. Boom, 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 boom. Pressure. Pressure. Pressure builds up. Discontent, tension, pressure bubbling up from the surface, which contributes to a certain frustration. Frustration on the part of the subject. Here we can see all the, livery issues of a long-term dedicated practitioners. Because the deficiency of the real engagement with oneself, with one's very vitality is absent, this humility is absent, this humble acceptance that there is lack, there is subjective division. more and more knowledge, more and more language, more and more methods. It just doesn't quite work. Tension, frustration, bubbling up. In the long run, in the long-term problem is obfuscation of long word, particularity. Obfuscation of particularity of each subject. This is why the solutions offered by religious discourses are stale. Why? Because they are applicable to everyone, but not to anyone specifically. Okay, we are all, say, we'll take Buddha's narrative as an example. We all have suffering. Why? Because there is ignorance. What to do about it? Practice direct knowing and the path. Cool. Why do you specifically have ignorance? What is the ignorance manifestation in your specific case? How do you experience this? What is the flavor and of suffering that is found exactly in you? The particularity and singularity of each case is not there. One size fits all formula is applied, disseminated by a master narrative, and doesn't quite reach the core of the issue. I suppose within a more close, intimate practice between the teacher and the student, this can be addressed, this specificity, and then teaching comes to life. Yeah, when someone who practices and takes on these signifiers applies them directly, specifically to their own flavor of dukkha, flavor of suffering or ignorance. But we will come back to that. Let us look a little bit more into the variety of reactions to Master's discourse, which we call subjective structures, really. I'll get rid of all that. Let's step away from a particular narrative, whether it's political artifice or religious narrative, and come back to the very narrative which we know as Oedipus complex, yeah? Because in psychoanalysis, synonym of Master's discourse is Oedipus complex. This is how Master's discourse creates the unconscious and engenders subjectivity. And as we know, there are four, some say three, I think it's four, including autistic subjectivities that human beings are functioning under. So the first one is obviously neurosis. This is a classic case of psychoanalysis and what it all started from. So what happens in neurosis is threefold, or at least how I differentiate it with respect to master signifier. Master signifier can be adopted. Let's say adoption. Adoption of S1, of master signifier. It can be taken up by a subject and agreed with, believed in, and that what we call maybe some kind of a successful developmental process when it comes to nos and subjectivity. This adoption of master signifier, everything that does not fit that model of viewing things, of tackling one's libido, is pushed away. It is pushed away as wrong. and you can see others as doing things wrong, and yeah, and you do it right, and fair enough, because you have adopted the master signifier of a certain tradition, of a certain someone, whatever, be it your father or the president or whatever the hell. So everyone else is wrong. So what happens then is repression, and that's the primary mechanism of neurosis, the repression. Repression will occur when that which does not fit to S1 is found in yourself. Because you will find it, because there is division within the subjectivity. So when you find it, whatever does not fit will be dumped into the unconscious, will start circulating in the unconscious and produce symptoms, which neurosis is known for. That's one option. Option 2 is what we call rebellion. Rebellion, viva la revolution. Rebellion against S1. In case of rebellion, the master's discourse is denied, rejected, and in cases of unsuccessful unfolding of Oedipus complex, this is due to a variety of reasons. It could be a weakness in the figure of the father, could be cruelty in the figure of the father. Excessive cruelty will do that as well. So in one way or another, a subject does not accept the discourse of the master given to them. What will happen then? Well, when the subject discovers that within them there is something that has been affirmed by master's discourse, and they have rebelled against that master's discourse, the repression will occur. The repression of that master signifier. So here we have repression of that which does not fit master signifier. Here we have repression of the master signifier itself and everything that stems from it. All the S2 which stems from this S1. So the common psychological truth that whether you obey your parents' commands or whether you rebel against them, result is the same. Neurosis. The stuff will be repressed. Yeah. However, there is a third option which I find interesting and actually very common. These are kind of classic options. What's going on? The third option is outward adoption, yet inward rebellion. Yeah. That's a kind of a common modern characteristic of neurosis. Outwardly, a subject accepts the narrative of the master signifier, of one's father, of one's government, of one's priest, of whatever, so that one can fit in the system. By the way, here in the rebellion, what produces a common that, you know, marginalized characters, various against the system, whatever their identity is. What it produces here is somebody who is outwardly in for the system, but inwardly actually rebels against it. Doesn't quite show it. So, in this case, there is twofold repression. Both that which is accepted gets dumped into unconscious, and that which is rebelled against gets dumped into unconscious too. So there is a lot. Well, not a lot. I can't really quantify in this sense. It's all psychic stuff. It's not even real. It's just words and acoustic images, the signifiers which circulate somewhere in the subterranean plane of one's psyche, which is as much subterranean as it is surface, as we know from Möbius strip model. In this case, consensus reality is accepted outwardly, yet in the fantasy, a subject cherishes another kind of reality, a different order of things. And that's why we differentiate between obsession and hysteria. So obsessive fantasizes perfect system. Hysteric fantasizes perfect master. These are very common fantasies which fly around, which get represented in the variety of media artifices, in art and cinema and whatever, in cases of psychoanalytic treatments. Because the subject still operates under master signifier, and master signifier, master discourse denies subjective division, what it seeks in fantasy, and that's fantasy, yeah, is fullness, isn't it? Precisely that message with which master discourse is disseminated. There is fullness. There is no luck. So we can create a perfect social order, be it communism or digital capitalism or, what have you. Or we can have a perfect master. This particular candidate from that particular party is going to do it all right. Or we can have a perfect religious practice. If you do things in this way, not in that way. We have this perfect guru, which people keep on seeking ad infinitum if they're hysteric. They keep hopping from guru to guru. So yeah, that's all trying to reenact that fantasy to incarnate this one. And that's a specifically very neurotic enterprise. We have 3 other modes. Let's look into psychosis. Within psychosis, what happens? What happens within the psychosis is that master signifier, so-called name of the father, or the particular way of father's dictum, which involves prohibition, not just repressed, but rejected. As what Freud have said, as he did say, or foreclosed, as Lacan said. Another form of master discourse, isn't it? So, here we are not even talking about adoption or rebellion against master's signifier. It just blah, out, away, rejected, evacuated from the picture. So what follows in this case, the consequences of such a radical move, is we have hallucinations. And why hallucinations occur? Because that which has been rejected, that very master signifier, returns from the real, from where it has been put. And we have elementary phenomena. Elementary phenomena. All these experiences, bodily experiences that psychotic person goes through during the decomposition process. Again, these are forms of return of the rejected, because you can't really ever reject everything. Yeah. It will come back. One says that there is no unconscious in psychosis. Well, unconscious is externalized. It has been radically put outside. Yeah. It's definitely Freud saw it as just a more radical form of repression within psychosis. Why? Again, similar reasons. Why? Maybe it's too weak or too twisted or too cruel, that message which comes from the other in the form of master discourse. So the subject has nothing to do with it, doesn't want to deal with it, just pushes it aside, pushes it away, and remains in the role of the object of the desire of the mother, primary caregiver, whereby the anxiety which it produces just overwhelms the subject, and then something eventually gives, and that's why we have triggering process, the psychotic break, and arising of this phenomena. So eventually these phenomena are stabilized via delusional metaphor. And what is delusional metaphor? Well, delusional metaphor is the master discourse which psychotic subject creates for themselves, their own artifice and their own symbolic order that arises from it. Why am I discussing these particular subjective structures? Well, just to show how they are all constituted vis-a-vis discourse of the master, in response to discourse of the master. We have the third one, and that's of course perversion. Perversion. Without further ado, the mechanism here in regards to master discourse is disavowal. Disavowal. The master discourse is denied its potency. Yeah. In some ways, perverts are actually clever. They kind of see that the king is naked, that there is a lack. They see that hidden truth of the other. Perhaps psychotics see it only all too well. Yeah. And that's what kind of breaks them. But subjective division is not all there is as well. So the perverted subject disavows the truth of the master, and instead they create their own. They manufacture themselves in the position of the master. Yeah. So the pervert is object A for the other. They are in a position of the object cause of enjoyment, object cause of desire. Instead of being infested by the object cause of desire as excess, they put themselves in that position. And what they produce is a particular kind of law, or perverted law, or their own discourse, their own system. But that system is only designed to delimit the excess of jouissance that they experience, because they have closed themselves off from the regulating function of the master's discourse. There are regulating functions to them as well. So what happens, they put themselves in that position of a master as a form of defense, and because they incarnate that very enigmatic someone who supposedly has an answer to discontent, because they're in this position of the object A. Neurotic subjects see them as gurus, as teachers, as masters, as those who are supposed to know, those who have answers. Yeah. But they don't. They only simply incarnate with their person that very horrifying, enigmatic dimension which neurotics within themselves repress. Yeah. The consequence of that is, of course, the splitting. Psychotic, oh sorry, perverted splitting of subjectivity. Yeah. Splitting of what they consider their own disseminated law, and that very, very rigid area, very difficult to deal with in perversion, more difficult than the psychosis even, I would say. That rigid area of the jouissance, which plagues them, but they, because they think they have a perfect solution for that, they won't even touch upon that. And that's normally seen within the forensic clinic, when the perverted subject who's done something horrible is asked what has driven you. They wouldn't even know. That's how much the split within the psyche is denied. Because why? Because pervert denies their split as well when they come up with their own perverted master discourse. They see the split in the other. They see that king is naked, but they don't see that they have split too. Their splitting is not seen for them. Okay, number 4, of course, is autistic structure. Autism. And in autism we have a more radical kind of foreclosure. We say it foreclosure. Let's say foreclosure of difference. The very mark of difference is foreclosed. I have a separate lecture on autism which can be looked, and I talk about it more in detail. So what happens is that autistic foreclosure operates on the level which precedes even psychotic foreclosure. There is a certain marker of difference, we call it unary trait within Lacanian jargon. It is that very registration within the psyche of something taking place. It's something before counting, before naming, just a registry of something taking place. So say there is some impingement of the real upon a subject's libidinal body, either from within or from without. Normally what happens is part of it is expelled. There is expulsion. But part of it is registered as an event. That's the unary trait. That's the difference. Something happens, whereas something just expelled. I just don't want to deal with it. That moment of expulsion is foreclosed. Only I don't want to deal with it is what remains. So that's my totality, my unity, is all that is left. This is why the entire field of the other, which is engendered by this unit of difference, the unary trait, maybe I'll write it down. Unary trait engenders the symbolic. The lower it gets on the board, the worse my writing becomes. Anyway, the unary trait engenders the whole of the symbolic order, the whole field of the other, field of language. This is where the difficulties with language with autism stem from. Yeah, the very unit of difference is foreclosed. So then there are other coping mechanisms or mechanisms of creating the other for autistic subjects, which I'm not going to go into. It's a lot to talk about. But interestingly, because that very initial unit of difference within autism is foreclosed, obviously what follows the very discourse of the master, which operates on the level of language, is also becoming foreclosed. So autistics are the most sort of removed from the master discourse. Hence all the issues with demand avoidance and whatever, perhaps not even interacting, mutism, etc. The other and its discourse are not even registered, not even allowed to enter. Yeah. Whereas 3 previous structures, they enter some kind of dialectic with the master narrative. Autism doesn't even enter that. They may pick it up later once they have devised their own regime of science or the order to be enjoyed within their own autistic terms. Autism, autoerotism, their own method, their own automatic way of dealing with language, dealing with others needs to be created first. So they're kind of, foolproof or other proof, proof from invasion of the other. Okay, these are common structural outcomes of master discourse as a functioning phenomenon. Let us look now at the sort of more general consequences of master discourse. A little bit more stuff. A little bit more blah blah blah. Consequences. Number one, ideology and group mentality. Yeah. As one way or another, master discourse engenders common ways of speaking, which hinge upon common ways of thinking, common ways of conceptualizing phenomena, and thereby binding jouissance in one particular style, which is characteristic of a group. Yeah. And good old Freud had good things to say about groups. I just quote him directly. So the state of the individual forming a part of a psychological group. He is no longer conscious of his acts in his case, as in the case of the hypnotized subject, whatever. At the same time that certain faculties are destroyed, others may be brought to a higher degree of exaltation. Under the influence of a suggestion, he will undertake the accomplishment of certain acts with irresistible impetuosity. This impetuosity is the more irresistible in the case of groups than in that of the hypnotized subject, from the fact that, the suggestion being the same for all the individuals in the group, it gains it in strength by reciprocity. We see then that the disappearance of the conscious personality, the predominance of the unconscious personality, the turning by means of suggestion and contagion of feelings and ideas in an identical direction, the tendency to immediately transform the suggested ideas into acts, these, we see, are the principal characteristics of the individual forming part of a group. He is no longer himself, but has become an automaton who has ceased to be guided by his will. Like I said, not much, end of the quote from Freud's Seminar 18, not much nice to say about people who operate under the same metric of master discourse. And we have seen in history what those people did, what fascism did, what Stalinism did. They all operated under the authority of a certain master who disseminated a certain narrative which did bind their jouissance in the way they enjoyed. Hence, all the others who don't function accordingly to that principle of enjoyment needed to be expelled, persecuted, or even downrightly eliminated. There was no conscious cause and effect moral will of the individuals who executed those acts. There was more or less really unconscious automaton functioning, following the railings of a discourse of a certain, in both cases I would say, of fascism and Stalinism, perverted master. Okay. There are more benign consequences of master discourse. One of those is siblings rivalry. Who can better embody the master narrative? You can again see it in the functioning of the groups. Who is the better incarnation of the teaching, or that the teacher expounds? Who does the better practice? Who is a better practitioner, or whatever? Even without them articulating it, it's quite visible in those communities, if you have interacted with those. People regurgitate learned formulas, they regurgitate even the words of the master, the way of thinking that they have adopted, and they compete with each other who is better at that. That's kind of cute. Yeah. More or less problematic consequence is ignorance. Ignorance in regard to the real. I even highlight it. Of the real. The subject is ignorant of one's own real because they have as one discourse of the master to substitute for that real. That's a problem. What I assume from the discourse of the master is just repeated. And that's, I would actually say, the fourth consequence. Repetition. Repetition. Yeah. Because master discourse produces more objeta, more surplus enjoyment, it just carries on. One comes back to the teacher for more teachings, for more ideology, for more legislation, for more know-how, for more workshops, for more accreditations, whatever. More encouragement, more imperatives, more degrees, more enthusiasm, more education. Encore, as Lacan would have it. Encore. Do it again. Yeah. Why? Well, because it's kind of also pleasant to have your jouissance bound by a certain master signifier. Yeah, it stops bothering you for a short while, but then it returns again with new vengeance. So, from all that, what can we say? I think I already said it. Master discourse engenders the unconscious. Master discourse engenders the unconscious. Its results are seen everywhere, from discontents with civilizations through to depression and onwards to perversion of modern capitalist systems. All of that functions as a search for solution, for not actually touching upon one's unconscious. Within capitalist system, which is a mutant of the master discourse, everyone is dissatisfied, everyone is rendered proletarian, busy yet dissatisfied, chasing the idea of a solution that master discourse will bring them, chasing the ideal of accomplishment which that narrative will deliver. It creates a false hope of attainment, of happiness in the future, via some kind of work, practice, repetition, etc. Whilst it is actually foreclosing one's direct access to the subjective division, one's direct access to sexual non-rapport, that Lacanian famous, there's no such thing as sexual relation. There is no, happy ending, happily ever after. And most importantly, it forecloses the fact that there is no other of the other. No other of the other. Boom, boom. This is foreclosed by the master discourse. Or is no other of the other? Well, of course, it's that, again, Lacanian statement alluding to the fact that there is no final big authority within the symbolic order which is going to nail it all. He's going to tackle that very jouissance, that very discontent, finally and for all. And there is no such system. There is no such practice. There is no such master. Yeah. There is no such governor, no such analyst. There is no such thing as the other of the other. Meaning that the master discourse is, of course, important, yeah, to this junction. Disjunctions applicable to any discourse. Disjunction of impotency and disjunction of impossibility. Yeah, it doesn't deliver what promised. Okay. Now, so what is true mastery then? Is there such a thing? Is there such a thing? Well, for those of us who do practice some kind of spiritual cultivation, the preliminary idea is that yes, there is true mastery, but it's very bloody difficult. Yeah, you can count on the fingers of one hand in the history of humanity those beings who achieved the full mastery of perhaps their potential as a human being, yeah. Full realization, enlightenment, unity with God. You have it named in different ways. It's a very difficult thing to do. Okay, how to do it? Like I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, well, certain someone like the Buddha has expounded well in the very clear terms, step-by-step fashion. You may put it to the test of practice, and that's how someone who actually, okay, let's get rid of this for a moment. True mastery. True mastery. Someone who takes on the S1, say from a major religious denomination. No acceptance of that S1, but also no rejection. Yeah, so that already obfuscates or cancels out three major neurotic tendencies and tendencies of other subjectivities. Because what are other subjectivities? Perversion, psychosis, and autism is just more radical forms of rejection of the master narrative. Someone who, well, perhaps has touched upon the real within oneself and took it with sincerity, without wanting to close one's eyes on it, or without wanting just stare at it, but perhaps had a glimpse of suffering, some kind of breakage in the flow of their subjectivity and the flow of their being, some kind of trauma or stroke of insight, or perhaps a great love that caused them to be disillusioned, but at the same time inspired, not broken, but shattered. Neither acceptance nor rejection of that truth disseminated as perhaps the teaching of the Buddha, as an example, occurs. So what follows is instead application is critical evaluation of the method. One applies it wholeheartedly, sincerely, but without blindness, with critical evaluation as to what does it do. Yeah. One takes on that method of doing things, that knowledge, that perhaps maxim, the sutra, the line from the teaching or whatever, and puts it to the test of one's own direct experience. One does not take beliefs, because beliefs cannot be verified by the test of direct experience. One takes on certain statements, certain methods, and trials them out. Yeah. By doing so, a subject produces their own unique solution to their drive pressure, their discontent, their suffering. And that unique solution within Lacanian framework is what we call synthon, saint, homme. Yeah, the saint. Who is the saint? I think I already talked about it in the discourse on capitalism. Someone who actually took on these principles of work with one's suffering, one's discontent, applied them to themselves, to their experience, and produced a solution which worked for them alone with two characteristic features: particularity and singularity. Particular and singular solutions to their dukkha, their discontent, their trauma, their suffering, their whatever, their state of being human. They have not done it as the copy-paste general application to all. They have done it specifically for themselves, with sincerity. They have not entered the shit show of sibling rivalry and competition who can do better in embodying master's discourse. No. They put it to the test of critical acclaim and worked with themselves on a day-to-day basis, not trying to achieve something, some kind of pat on the back from master or some new accreditation from a system which disseminates those, but actually to resolve something within them, to tackle, to treat their own real. That is synthon. Perhaps they have done it to such an extent that they have actually achieved that level of mastery which only a few in the human history have. Yeah? Perhaps. But that's the beginning of it anyway. Okay, that's kind of all I had to say in regards to master's discourse and what's the problematic, what's its consequence, and what are the ways of working it. Why I'm doing it? Well, just to expound upon the structures. Because as we know, the knowledge disseminated in structural fashion, is actually helpful, as opposed to knowledge disseminated in a way of just collecting things. It's another form of narcissism. Whereas when you understand causality, brick by brick, its interconnectedness with bigger picture, it's a bit better. That's the knowledge within the symbolic, which you can perhaps apply to your own real, only having put it through the test of your own critical acclaim. Thank you.